So just how did Amherst, a ragtag group of investors, take big Wall Street banks like JP Morgan, RBS, and Bank of America for over $100 million? I guess it all started when a group of California home buyers were sold subprime mortgages they could never afford. These mortgages were so infamously toxic, they sparked a frenzy of Wall Street gamblers to invent crazy ways of betting on their failure. That's right. The banks wanted these particular homeowners to fail. Peak of the madness, over $130 million in bets were made on only $30 million of mortgages in this pool. That means there were 5 separate Wall Street wagers for every one struggling homeowner in the pool. Our hero, Amherst, sensed there was an opportunity to take advantage of this frenzy. And in fact, a loophole in the way these bets were made left the banks exposed. Amherst was determined to exploit this loophole, save our homeowners, and take the big banks for over $100 million. I call this story the Amherst Arbitrage. It's a relatively unknown story about one of the greatest financial takedowns of our generation. Let's rewind to 2005. Harold the homeowner just bought a beautiful, expensive California home. He stretched himself thin, buying at peak prices, and needed a lot of help from his friendly neighborhood mortgage broker, Brett. You see, Harold was a ninja. A ninja? Scary, right? Well, it should have been for Brett, the mortgage broker, since ninja stands for homebuyer with no income, job, or assets. But I don't have any money for a down payment, Harold said. Down payment? That's the old way of doing things, the broker responded. Just sign on the dotted line and the home is yours. Now, I don't need to tell you that this wasn't the best idea. Many homeowners got into a lot of trouble, overextending on home purchases leading up to the great financial crisis. But Harold was about to go on a uniquely wild ride. Harold didn't know this, but Brett, the mortgage broker, never really planned on hanging on to the mortgage. That explains why Brett wasn't too interested in underwriting Harold's ability to afford those monthly payments. Brett sold the mortgage through a Byzantine network of intermediaries into the hands of the Lehman Brothers. Yes, I'm talking about the Lehman Brothers. First big bank to go down launching the 2008 crisis. The Lehman Brothers took this mortgage and did what they did best, namely pooled it with other toxic mortgages and sold tranches to Wall Street banks and financial institutions around the world. This particular pool was comprised of $335 million worth of California subprime 2005 vintage mortgages. Now, while 2005 was a good vintage for California wine, it was not a good vintage for California mortgages. The following years marked an historic drop in home prices, putting many homeowners underwater. Approximately 10 million Americans had to be displaced from their homes, and in 2008 alone, 3.1 million Americans filed for foreclosure. By March 2009, over 90% of the mortgages in Harold's pool had either defaulted or prepaid. That means that of the original 300 million in mortgages, only about 30 million were still alive. This was, by historical standards, one of the most toxic pools of mortgages ever created. But Harold was a fighter and counted himself among the 10% of survivors, but he was just barely scraping by. He's 90 days late on his payments and was on the brink of foreclosure. Harold needed a bailout. Sadly, the government didn't bail out regular homeowners, so he was going to have to settle for a miracle. Speaking of bailouts, the government did bail out many of the financial institutions on Wall Street in the 11th hour of the crisis. You see, these institutions were in a lot of pain. When all the toxic mortgages began defaulting, it became almost impossible for the banks that owned them to sell them off, even for a loss. This is known as a liquidity crisis. Mortgages are such big assets that it takes a lot of time, effort, and liquid cash to make the purchase or sale, even if you are a willing buyer. In 2008, there wasn't a lot of liquid capital. And to be frank, buyers weren't really enthusiastic about mortgages. To solve this problem, Wall Street invented a derivative known as the credit default swap. And the climax of the story hinges on the power of the credit default swap, so I will explain it briefly in very simple terms. The credit default swap is just a fancy way of betting on the failure of a particular mortgage or mortgage pool. It's kind of like betting against your favorite sports team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. You pay a bit of money up front to place the bet, and if they lose, you get a big payout. Sure, deep down, you wanted them to win. But wouldn't it be nice to win a bit of money as a hedge against the emotional pain of yet another failed playoff run? Now, when used correctly, credit default swaps are a convenient form of insurance. Instead of going through the hassle of selling off toxic mortgage pools, banks can effectively limit their losses by buying credit default swap insurance on those pools. In theory, the profits from the credit default swaps will cancel out the losses from the failing mortgages. Now, insurance companies aren't stupid. If you build a home in a flooded hurricane zone, you can expect to pay extremely high premiums to insure your home against floods and hurricanes. This is also true for credit default swaps. If the mortgages are considered too risky, then the premiums on the insurance will also be high. In fact, for our Lehman Bros California subprime 2005 vintage, Harold's pool, the cost of insuring these toxic mortgages was between 80 and 90 cents for every dollar of protection. That's an extremely pessimistic expectation that 80 to 90% of mortgages in Harold's pool will fail. You can always trust Wall Street to take a good thing too far. The madness began when speculators realized they could use credit default swaps to outright gamble on which mortgage pools would fail. They didn't even need to have a stake in the underlying mortgage. This will seem absurd under the following analogy. Just imagine that I obtained fire insurance on your home. Well, let's just say I had a real good feeling that your house would burn down, and I wanted to make a lot of money when that happened. If that were possible, you certainly wouldn't want to see me anywhere near your home with a bright orange jug and a box of matches. Credit default swaps were so easy to trade and became so popular that the market for gambling on mortgage failures with credit default swaps exploded, despite the obvious moral hazard. Harold's toxic pool was so bad that it became the benchmark gambling pool. Everyone on Wall Street wanted in on the action. JP Morgan, RBS, and Bank of America were just a few of the banks that bet over $130 million worth of CDS insurance on the just $30 million worth of mortgages left in Harold's pool. That means that for each mortgage in the pool, there were about 5 people betting it would fail. Not an inspiring amount of confidence in our homeowner Harold or the few remaining neighbors in his mortgage pool. With great absurdity comes great opportunity. The hero of our story is Amherst Holdings, a small real estate investment firm based in Austin, Texas. Amherst devised a creative and ambitious plan which involved becoming an insurer of as many credit default swap contracts as they could possibly get their hands on. But only on the special condition that it was Harold's pool that was insured. This seemed insane, and Wall Street couldn't believe someone would be so stupid to take all of the risk insuring one of the most toxic pools of mortgages ever created. Sure, Amherst got to collect some pretty sizable premium payments, but it would risk having to pay out a massive portion of the over $100 million of insured value if those mortgages were to fail. Wall Street was certain these mortgages would fail, but Amherst was even more certain that every single remaining mortgage in Lehman's toxic pool of 2005 vintage California subprime garbage would survive. So, how could Amherst be so certain? What was the one thing that they could do to guarantee Harold and all the other delinquent mortgages in this pool would get paid? Remember, because there were over 5 people betting on every single mortgage, Wall Street had to pay Amherst over $100 million of insurance premiums, even though there was only about $30 million of outstanding mortgage value. So, after locking in the bets, Amherst took a portion of those premiums and just paid off every last one of the mortgages. And poof, just like that, there were no mortgages left to fail. Harold got his miracle. In his mind, his mortgage was paid off by a generous benefactor. In reality, Amherst just used him as a pawn to guarantee a massive profit at the expense of the banks, who gambled on his failure. And it wasn't altruism, but greed that paid for Harold's mortgage. Nevertheless, I'm sure he didn't mind. It's not often you hear about the little guy taking down Wall Street for over $100 million. It's even more uncommon for it to happen at the benefit of ordinary people. Amherst's creative strategy helped them flourish into a presently successful real estate business. It allowed many homeowners to keep their homes during the mortgage meltdown in 2008. All in all, the banks learned a valuable lesson. It's better to use insurance to insure your own assets rather than to gamble on someone else's failure. It's not hard to take a moral stance on the Amherst Arbitrage. Sure, they made a lot of money, but shared those winnings with many struggling homeowners. Still, I can't shake that iffy feeling about taking $100 million of bets and then fixing the outcome. Depending on who I tell this story to and whether or not they work in finance, I get very different opinions. I'm curious to hear what you think of the ethics of the Amherst Arbitrage. So please leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe.